Good evening. It's Sunday night, so time for another Savvy Chat. I'm Jen Horangeff, your host here, and tonight we are joined by another super special guest, and this is going to be a really great conversation tonight with Mark Liber from Startup Health. And he's going to talk to us about one of Savvy's core values that we call celebrate success and grow from failure. And this is something super important to talk about with all companies and how they can kind of go on their journey to create meaningful solutions. So just to tell you a little bit about Mark, and he'll introduce himself too, but he's the Academy Manager at Startup Health. And he actually has a background going back and looking at all sorts of different grant opportunities through SBIR and has been working on other health tech innovations. So it's going to be a really great opportunity for him to share what he's seen. So Mark, say hello and tell us where you're calling in from tonight.
Hey everybody, and hey Jen, thanks for having me tonight. I've heard a lot about this show, so excited to be on it. I'm calling from New York City, from my apartment actually, on Sunday night. But yeah, excited to chat a little bit more about Savvy, about learning from failure, about how to kind of persevere within healthcare space and others. I joined Startup Health about 2 years and change ago, about 16 months ago, and coming from a background in biology, biomedical research, and I did my master's at Weill Cornell here in New York City in healthcare policy research and economics. So went from the very micro, doing bench research in healthcare, to the very macro, the system in general, system at large, learning about all the wonderful things that we all love about healthcare in that way, and found Startup Health as an awesome opportunity to learn a little bit more about the digital health space and be able to work with a bunch of entrepreneurs within healthcare that are working on transformative technologies and applications. And when I started Startup Health, we had about 120 companies or so, if I'm remembering correctly. And now we're at 250. So it's been quite a bit of growth since I've been at Startup Health, and really exciting to be a part of.
Awesome. Yeah, and we'll dive into more like what you're doing and talking about what even Startup Health is. So kind of backing up, we're going to talk about celebrating success and learning and growing from those failures. And since you just told us, you're working with 100, 200, 300 companies and have these touch points with them, you really are in a good sort of position to help us kind of think through that. So, as somebody who now has started a startup myself, I can fully admit that I didn't really know what incubators were or accelerators. I'm not even sure if I heard the term. And then as I kind of started entering into the space from academia over into industry, I'm like, what are those things? So kind of just to first set the stage of what that even means to interface with these kind of companies, can you tell us a little bit about what is an incubator and what is Startup Health?
Yeah, absolutely. And totally same boat as you there. When I joined from academia, I had no idea what any of this stuff was. So it's been quite the baptism of fire since then. And when I joined Startup Health, I learned pretty quickly about what an accelerator or incubator is, two terms that are often interchangeably used and kind of help understand one another, I think, a little bit. But people usually think of incubators or accelerators as boot camps for early stage startups to really learn about refining their idea, going to market, refining a pitch, really taking a company from just an idea to a place where it could raise investor money or enter the market or build another version of their product, whatever their current challenges are. And on the other end of the boot camp, to really be able to set sail in a way and have success. And so typically when you think of accelerators or incubators, you think of some of the household names in technology like Y Combinator or Techstars or 500 Startups. Many of those, Techstars is actually located all over the country, and I think all over the world, if I'm not mistaken. They have several different outposts. 500 Startups and Y Combinator are really based in the Bay Area, and it's always been the hub of technology in a lot of ways. But back when I started, and for the first year and a half or so, Startup Health would always get confused between, or thought of as an accelerator or thought of as an incubator, and compared to those two. I think there's a couple key differences between what we do at Startup Health and what a typical accelerator does. And we're actually really complementary in that way, I think. Accelerators being typically 3 months or so long boot camps, regional. So startups would need to relocate to be there and kind of live in the space for 3 months or so. And early stage, so seed stage specific usually. And startups often, or accelerators often come with funding attached to them. For example, Y Combinator will give $120,000 in exchange for a certain percent of the applying company. And then that company gets that money, but also gets the benefit of the boot camp. Startup Health has a model that's a little bit different, and it's really tailored around healthcare. And I'll just kind of go over the three differences between what I just mentioned and Startup Health. We're actually a global program. So our portfolio is comprised of companies located all over the world, about 80% in the US, but 20% in places like Canada, Europe, Africa, Australia, Singapore, South America as well. I think we're in 20 countries or so now by my latest count. We are also a stage agnostic, so not seed stage specific. We have companies that have raised tens of millions of dollars, and we have companies that are just still at the idea stage. So really a wide range of company stages there, which has some interesting fallout, I guess, which is really cool. And then thirdly, which I think is really important, especially since it's healthcare, is that we are a lifetime program for companies. So as opposed to a 3-month boot camp where in healthcare, you're pretty lucky if you can find somebody at your potential customer site to talk to you. We partner with our companies for the duration of the company's existence until exit, until we haven't had any IPOs yet, but until IPO, until the company may no longer be operational. And so kind of between that and the stage agnostic nature of what we do, I think it has a lot of benefits that would be different from what an accelerator would be, where you would just kind of jump in for 3 months, have a demo day at the end, and then be free to go on your merry way. We partner with companies that are really early, that are later stage for the duration of their life cycle. So there's a lot of challenges that a company might have at the early stage that they don't have when they've raised a Series B, or vice versa. And so it creates a community within Startup Health where everybody can learn from each other and learn from each other's experiences, and that plays back into helping younger companies grow.
Yeah, that's
that's kind of it in a nutshell.
I'm sure that also simplifies it, but in the interest of time, I think it's great to hear that too, that you're really seeing companies across their life cycle and the different challenges that they may run into. And I think that really touches upon what we're trying to get at here today is what are those challenges, and how do you start to kind of tease through them, learn from them, and also recognize when there are wins along the way. So you see all these different companies, just kind of for somebody who maybe isn't familiar with starting a startup, how would you describe sort of like the entrepreneurial journey and what it is like to have a startup, both from just getting going to, maybe those Series A, Series B, and for those who are also unfamiliar with those terms, these mean different rounds of funding to continue to get more and more funding for your company. So kind of talk us through, what do you think from kind of the outside looking in, what is that journey for most companies and entrepreneurs?
Yeah, for sure. We've seen a lot, and the journey I think can be boiled down to really high highs and really low lows. And what being an entrepreneur is, I think, and as far as we've seen, is really takes a person that's a special type of person that it has an idea, has a drive, has an overarching mission that they want to accomplish, and will really stop at nothing until that's achieved. And that long-term commitment, I think, is really the foundational piece of what it takes to be an entrepreneur, and to kind of sail through the highs and sail through the lows. Without that, it's easy to buckle at challenges when they come, rather than find ways around it and to try to continue to make your idea come to life, or a company come to life. And so that, I think, is a core foundation to what it takes, to what it's like to be an entrepreneur, to be able to live in that long-term commitment zone, and really take the long view on what you're doing, take all the challenges in stride, and celebrate the wins, as you said. So as you're building a company, there's whether it's at the early stage or at the later stage, at the Series B or beyond, the company will have certain challenges that they kind of repeat themselves in a way. At first, you're trying to tell your company's story to get somebody to listen, whether that's an investor or a potential customer, or, as you know, trying to bring team members on board that are going to help you, that might be better than you at certain things and can take things off your plate and help to make the company function. That challenge kind of exists whether you have a product or not, even if you're really early, or if you've raised significant money down the road. Those challenges always kind of exist, but they manifest themselves a little bit differently. And so what I think is really important, what we spend a lot of time on at Startup Health, is we know that the challenges are going to be there for the company, and they're going to repeat, and they're going to come back in different ways and different forms. Really, the first kind of core challenge that we work with our companies on is separating the entrepreneur from the company, which is kind of interesting, because if you are an entrepreneur, probably the company is so tied to your happiness and so tied to your life that it's kind of hard to, I mean, it's your baby in a way. It's kind of hard to separate the two and really take things in stride and rationalize them. And so by separating the two, the company is obviously very important to you, but you as an entrepreneur need to be able to take care of yourself and be able to recognize challenges when they arise, be able to put them in context, solve them, and be able to celebrate the wins, as you said, which are really important to keeping going.
Yeah, and so like talking about that a little bit more, that I don't think people really understand the like you say, the high highs and the low lows. And I think we see in the media and other places when things go wrong, and there may be a propensity to certain individuals kind of ignoring those what could be perceived as failures or challenges, just trying to stay positive and move on from them, and just choose to highlight like what's going on. I mean, what do they call that too in the social media world, when you're just sharing like all the awesome stuff that's happening to you?
Oh yeah.
What is that term? I can't remember, but like,
I'm not sure, but I know what you mean. For sure.
Or something, because you're only, I don't know, but yeah, that you're only representing yourself in a certain way. So, and then there's the opposite, right? That others might be more prone to, focusing on the challenges they're facing and not really looking at what they're doing right. So let's first kind of dive into that of talking about those what we consider failures. I don't mean that in like a derogatory way, but something that one could learn from. So how do you even start to talk about that? How do you convey that to startups or entrepreneurs when they're starting off? And I see this, certainly there are many entrepreneurs with what I would consider sort of that braggadocio. They think they've got it all figured out, and it gets messy. So how do you coach them, and how do you see that when things go wrong?
Definitely, and that is definitely something that is important, to project confidence when you're talking to people, and sometimes that comes across as being overly assertive, and sometimes they're braggadocious, as you said. I think what it really takes, and it's hard to teach that aspect to entrepreneurs until they taste it for themselves, or at least until they know they can recognize that moment when it happens. I can give a really easy example that probably anyone can identify with, and if you're an entrepreneur or not, but that feeling of being told no, whether it's by an investor or by a potential customer or by someone you wanted to hire that you couldn't, or whether it's just somebody that you wanted to talk to that said they didn't have time. That is, for any entrepreneur, that's a pretty common failure in a way, and because they're not able to essentially do what they wanted to do. And for somebody who hasn't felt that before, it could be pretty harsh feeling, and kind of makes it definitely seen as a failure. What we do in that situation, and this I think can be taken to any application in your life really, is to take that no as an opportunity to get feedback. What we do a lot of times is coach our entrepreneurs on reaching out to folks, having conversations, and even if there's a no, being able to walk away with a core piece of feedback about what they could be doing better or why that no was given, because that can all feed back into the whole process of learning, refining your message, and going at it again with somebody else. So that's a good example of, I think, taking a setback and turning it into something that's really productive. And we've had entrepreneurs who have sent 20 emails to investors, and a couple responded and all of them said no. And they really walk away with nothing tangibly, I guess. But in reality, and that's often the perception by them, they're thinking, oh, well, I failed. Nobody's interested in this. Actually, that's a great opportunity to get feedback from a lot of people, those who respond at least, about why this might not be a fit or what they could be doing better, what they should be thinking about. That approach, I think, serves people really well in a business setting, but also builds stronger relationships with the people they're trying to target, who in turn are more willing to help them. So I'm not sure if I exactly answered your question, but I think having that perspective of there's going to be highs and there's going to be lows leads nicely into taking the lows as opportunities to kind of take positive steps forward, even though it might seem like 3 steps back, 1 step forward.
No, I think that's a really great way of framing it. And this is clearly something that's not unique to just these smaller stage companies. This is something that we see, of course, in larger companies, both in and out of healthcare. And sometimes when these large companies have them, those failures can become quite public. And so even just kind of stepping out of the healthcare arena, where have you seen there be sort of like that public scrutiny, and how you think that particular company might have handled it? I'm sure there are countless examples that many of us are familiar with that we see in the news. Do you have any sort of ideas about what happens when large companies fail?
Yeah, and when the larger the company that fails, the more public it is. And I feel like we read about something with Uber or Lyft every single day. Kind of the easy example to point to. I actually just watched a documentary on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called Dirty Money, I think.
No, I haven't.
There's the first episode of it is actually about Volkswagen. And back between 2009 and 2015, I guess this all came to light in 2015. Maybe it was 2016, but thereabouts anyway. Volkswagen was covering up their emissions, their nitrous oxide emissions.
Mm-hmm.
And it all came to light in 2015, and there was huge press controversy all about it. In a nutshell, what happened is the company had to comply with new air quality regulations in the EU and in the US by 2009, I think. And just before then, they announced a new clean diesel technology, I think in a year or two before that, which was supposed to be the newest, most fuel efficient, cleanest diesel ever. And they did release the product in time. And then in 2015, it was discovered that those cars were, when they were road tested, actually had worse emissions than the previous version. And so it kicked off a whole study into, okay, why did this happen? How could this be? And it turns out that, I might get some of the details wrong, but in a nutshell, they either were not able to come out with the car in time to comply with their announcements, or they didn't have the technology at all that they promised. And so they actually developed software that they installed in the cars to cheat emission tests.
Okay.
And so that's a really good example of kind of, I guess, corporate deception of people, where they didn't have the pieces in place. They did it anyway. They found a way around it. However that happened organizationally, probably from the result of a lot of people trying to hit a deadline. I think that often happens, and cutting corners in order to hit the deadline. This was the outcome. And they got away with it for 5 years or so, but you're never going to get away with that forever. I think that's a public company, different, obviously very different from a smaller company, but I think that the principles of going about it the right way from the beginning, that's where it becomes really important. And if you take take that into healthcare, which is a lot easier for me to point to healthcare examples because I just know more. I read more about this space than others. If you take the examples of Outcome Health or Theranos being probably the most famous example, or infamous, I guess, example of a company which overpromised their technological capabilities and had really charismatic leadership that convinced a lot of people to give them a lot of money. And it turned out that they didn't have any of those puzzle pieces in place. And the company just went officially closed down, I think last week or the week before. So that's kind of a failure where probably the outlook of the leadership was not in line with what we talked about a couple of minutes ago about taking failures in stride and putting them in context and setting a clear way forward. Actually, the outcome was, push ahead, find a way around it through deception, and maybe solve the problem later. But ultimately, even if there was intentions to, it doesn't really work when you have other forces at play.
Yeah, and I mean, you just talked about two kind of extreme examples too, where people are being purposely deceptive so that they can just keep going forward. And maybe they didn't have everything figured out along the way. And, thinking about if they were to have been more honest with some of those challenges, then both how could they learn from them, and also how could then either advisors or other people around them, other organizations, can help them. I think sometimes when we don't talk about these things, then nobody knows that you're kind of saying, please help. And so you're not getting the resources that you need. So it's not that failures are necessarily something that means that you're down and out and you can't come back from, but it's kind of just a way of saying, this is not necessarily something we've completely figured out yet, and welcome people who may have more expertise. And,
Absolutely.
Yeah. And thinking about that too, then, I'm somebody who has severe imposter syndrome. Again, I'm coming from academia, and so now entering into sort of the business world, this has been something very new for me. So I'm kind of somebody who probably swings more in the opposite direction and says, I haven't figured this all out yet, so please help. But then also, I think, you talked about it too. You mentioned that people need to come up with a certain level of confidence. And I think coupled with that is also recognizing when you've done something right and you've reached some of these milestones, and you can celebrate that. And I do think that for other entrepreneurs like myself or other companies, that part can also be challenging. So how do you even get companies or entrepreneurs to think about that, like if they've been successful?
Definitely. And we have kind of tactful ways that we do that with. One of the things we do with our companies is a quarterly check-in, where we have a quarterly workshop that everybody joins and kind of discusses the top 3 achievements from the last quarter on the company side, top 3 achievements for the last quarter on the personal side, which is always really fun to hear about all the things that people have done that is not related to their company, like running Ironmans or running marathons, stuff like that. A lot of having kids, things like that even pop in. It's really fun. And then talking about the specific areas where they feel great and they might be able to help others, but also areas where they feel a little bit low and in need of support and they need help from others. And so that's at Startup Health. That's what we do every quarter with all our companies is that check-in. And even though we've institutionalized it for our companies, there's a lot of ways that anyone could really do these things. And I'll talk about it from a personal level, and then I'll talk about it again more from a company perspective that anyone could benefit from. But on the personal side, one of the things that is really helpful to having the confidence to set your agenda and goals and then hitting them and then being able to project that, it kind of starts with taking care of your own mindset, I guess, in a way. So one of the things that a lot of people do, and I've started doing this as well, I'm trying to get more regular about it, is really setting intentionality for days and weeks about things that you want to accomplish and being open with that. So when you're able to tell others, I want to do these things this week, or when you're able to tell your colleagues or your team members, we want to accomplish this week. That's really the first step in setting the right goals that you can achieve to be able to rally everybody around you. Then comes expressing gratitude on a daily basis about what you've accomplished that day. It's so easy to forget all the good things that happened, no matter how minor they are in the context of your daily life or running a business, that setting time aside to really think about all the good things that happened is critical on a daily basis, I think, to really take inventory of all the things that happened. And then on a weekly basis, following back up with those goals that you set and seeing how you did in relation to them. And so what this does is builds confidence in you, because you're seeing yourself hit your goals and you're seeing all the good things that have happened that you might not have realized happened. And also others can see it too. So for someone with imposter syndrome, which I had to a degree, it doesn't seem like you don't know what you're doing at all if you're able to wrap on the week and say, look at all the things we did, we hit all our goals. And just from the front stage perspective, that doesn't come across at all. So that's another thing that we coach on a personal level, is that, but on a company level is encouraging our companies to provide regular updates to all of their collaborators, whether it's advisors, investors, customers, team members, which really summarizes wins, summarizes priorities, and summarizes where they might need help. And even the structure of that kind of message in that order, leading with the wins, ending with an ask, makes people believe in you, see the credibility that you have, and then especially if you have a good sound ask at the end, and there's a little bit of an art to that, and you don't want to ask for $10 million, obviously, but asking something like, hey, we would love an introduction to company X. We've been trying to make inroads for a long time. Something like that is much more likely for someone to help you. So I guess from a personal and a company perspective, it's all about establishing credibility that you know what you're doing, because you obviously do. Otherwise, you wouldn't be starting the company you're starting and running it. And no matter your background, it doesn't really matter, because the progress is evident, is what I was going to say. The progress is evident. And that just breeds further confidence, because you're able to get the support of others who can help you along the way.
Yeah, I mean, you make me laugh, because before we got on this chat, Mark and I were comparing notes on our habits of our desktop tabs and all of these things. So Mark and I are very different, and then I have a lot of stuff going on. And I joke that my co-founder, Ronnie, who is opposite I am, he will look at our Trello board and say, Jen, if you aren't moving it along, if you aren't completing these tasks, like, don't put it as your next thing to do. And I feel sometimes like a failure, because I set out with those intentions, like, this is what I'm going to do this week, here are the tasks, and then you just end up answering emails all week or whatever it might be, and you can never get to that. And I think, just as you say, recognizing that you've still accomplished something, however, it might not be what you set out to do, is also a reality that I'm sure many people in just life face, not starting a company or anything like that. So kind of circling it back too, because so many of our listeners and people that we interact with are our patients or caregivers or others that are just interested in what we're doing, but might not have a company. They're not a startup, or they might not have those sort of areas of leading a team and being able to set these sort of intentions. So like you talk about on an individual level, what is something that somebody could do in their sort of day-to-day life with either, just the errands, the family care, the other things they have to do? Do these things still apply? Like, how can people start to create that mindset of celebrating success and learning from those challenges or failures?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there is even though you might have, let me start over. I think there should be a lot of tiers of things that you want to accomplish, whether it's, there's a lifetime goals that you want to accomplish. There's monthly goals, maybe there's yearly goals, there's weekly goals, all kinds of things, from going to pick up the groceries all the way to building a company that impacts millions of people. It doesn't really, I don't want to say it doesn't matter which one of those things is at the forefront, because it does, but it's in many ways the same processes that you can start to institute for yourself to keep making sure you're on the right track and moving forward. And one of the places that I always start is to really recognize that it is your life and it is a time period you're working with. And so it requires that you kind of be engaged in what you want to do that whole time. So if it's a lifetime goal of building a family and providing for them, then you need to make sure that you're kind of there on a daily basis to make sure that happens. Or if it's building a company that impacts millions of people, you need to be there on a daily basis for the long term to make sure that happens. And if one of the quickest ways to not get there is to burn out and to really kind of burn the candle at both ends and get sick of what you're doing, basically. And so that not doing that is kind of the core of a lot of the things that we coach on from a personal and a company level. One of the things that I think is really important first step there is, we talked a little bit about setting goals, but setting goals in relation to each of those different types of objectives you're going for that are reachable. So if you're setting goals that you're going to check the box off and complete, you're going to build confidence, you're going to be encouraged, you're going to want to keep going at it. And I think that's a sign that you're setting really good goals and moving it forward. And I bet if you look back on after a couple of weeks, you could see really the A and the B, where you started, where you went to, and how that made a difference. What becomes really works against you, I'll say, would be setting goals that you know that you can't, or setting really aggressive goals that you may or may not be able to hit. Because if you're not reaching your goals, then you tend to slip more into that negative space of, I'm not accomplishing as much as I want to accomplish. Why am I not be able to get anything done? And you kind of lose perspective on the things that you did do. So I think setting goals, number one, after setting that long-term objective is really important. And then the third thing, which without it, I think you won't have the perspective to see what you accomplished, is really just setting time aside to look back on what you did. One of the things that I'm trying to do is every night before I go to bed, reflecting on the day and all the things that I did that moved me towards the end destination. Even if it's as simple as sending one email, that's still a win. If someone didn't respond to my email, that's could be a loss, but at the same time, maybe that's a sign that I should rethink my approach to, maybe I should be emailing somebody else, or maybe I should be talking to somebody else. So setting that time aside to see what you've done and how it relates to the end is really key, to have that perspective that we talked about a couple times here, which is all towards celebrating the things that went well and keeping to win your own game, I guess, is the way I think about it.
Yeah. And I mean, just hearing you say all those things, if I step out of my entrepreneur hat and into the hat I know so much better, is sort of the patient one. I think all of that holds true, that every day is kind of a constant negotiation with what you're, physically capable of accomplishing. And it can be really discouraging for so many patients that feel like they're not getting that to-do list or just what they want to do done. But like you say, kind of reflecting on what were they able to do, what does that mean on how they should think about the next day. I always reflect that I have this one friend who gave me some great advice one time when I was painting my apartment, and I went all out and I painted, and I was so happy that I did, but my body was totally thrashed. I was miserable for days on end just because I overdid it. But just that she had said, well, this is a great way to reflect on, what you need to do tomorrow. And it was like the perfect advice for a patient to hear, is not that you can't do it, but how can you learn from what you are doing to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success in the future. So I think all that you've shared is applicable both in business and on just sort of the day-to-day lives that we all lead. So
Definitely.
moving into our fun little rapid fire questions. Always love to hear what people, are doing outside of their work and how they think that we can move this whole thing called healthcare forward. So to start off, what do you do for fun when you're not being savvy and helping others or other companies?
Definitely, and this is the fun part, rapid fire. Not that the other wasn't. It's fun stuff. I think the thing that I do is one of the things I'm really interested in is CrossFit. I'm really into CrossFit. You mentioned painting. For me, I go every morning before work, almost every morning, and it's really that time to set everything aside. Even the basement gym I go to has no cell service, so that's cool. But setting everything aside and kind of going at something that's usually pretty tough and demanding, and I usually end up in a pile of sweat laying on the floor. But it's kind of, if you're able to do that at 6:30 in the morning, then nothing that happens the rest of the day is really that hard, because you can kind of take it in stride and put it in perspective. So yeah, that's my thing.
Wow. So, oh my gosh, you folks that do CrossFit always just amaze me. You're like rolling tires and doing amazing things. So that's cool that you kind of have that in your day-to-day life. So that's awesome. So, in the same vein, what's something quirky that people don't necessarily know about you?
This one was hard. I had to ask a bunch of people about this one. But ultimately I knew the answer. It was, I have pretty bad FOMO for a lot of things. And so before the call, we talked about conferences and deciding whether or not to go to them. This would be really hard for me. Luckily, I don't choose which conferences I go to. Somebody tells me, so that's good. I don't have to say, oh, but what if I met one person there that I didn't foresee? Kind of like I met you at South by Southwest, I think, and that was one of those fortuitous things. So I struggle with that quirky thing, and it goes from that all the way to, some friends are going out to a new restaurant, and I don't want to miss it for whatever. Even though I'm super tired and am not hungry, I'll end up going. So that, I don't think it's that unique of a thing, but definitely a quirky thing that kind of drives me crazy sometimes.
Yeah, well, we both just noted that we're here in New York City, as one of the conferences that we might usually be at. Health 2.0 is happening over in the Bay Area. So for all those who are watching and also having that FOMO over there, thanks for joining. We're here with you. All right, so here's one that
we're having fun here. Yeah, they're missing out.
You there? All right, so here's one you're definitely qualified to answer. What is one of the biggest healthcare headaches or challenges that you personally think we have to address?
Yeah, this is a good one. There's so many that people talk about as being. I don't really see too much prioritization of them, which is good, because I think there's a lot of challenges that impact a lot of people. One of the ones for me, and maybe it's because my dad is a doctor and I kind of grew up seeing him operate, and since then kind of being in healthcare throughout, one of the things for me, I think, is physician burnout, which is becoming more and more publicized as of late. And I think they have this thing called the healthcare triple aim, which is all about improving healthcare quality, and it's reducing costs, improving outcomes, and the third one is escaping me at this exact second. But they just added a fourth one, which is improving the provider experience, so improving doctors' lives, I guess, which is, to me, an awesome idea, because doctors treat so many patients for things that they are suffering from, and are really that touch point to healthcare. And without them, I certainly wouldn't know. I would use the internet to find information, which is totally unreliable. I'd want to go to someone trustworthy. So one of the big challenges for me is really finding a way for doctors to be able to treat patients better, and also be able to keep going and not burn out, I think is one of the central things for me.
Yeah, well, shout out to one of our friends, Janae Sharp, from the Sharp Index, that is working on that to make sure that we're considering, physician burnout. So that's super important. All right, well, closing it out with my very favorite question that I give people a heads up on. So I'm super curious to hear what you picked for the song title that you think best describes the current state of healthcare.
It's good. Very, very good. I spent a lot of time on this one. The playlist that people have chosen already has a lot of really good ones. For me, so I'm an optimist, and I think that things are pretty crazy and bad right now in a lot of ways. But I think also there's a lot of good things happening, a lot of good healthcare happening. There's a lot of movement towards recognizing some of the problems and making them better, especially getting more and more people involved. Government's been really involved as of late. We read about companies like Apple and Amazon that are really putting a lot of eggs in the healthcare basket, which has a lot of promise. And so my song is I Can Only Imagine by David Guetta. And I think Chris Brown is featured on there just because I think there's a lot of potential, and it's fun to think about all the possibilities and how things could get better. And it's ultimately, even though where things are at might not be so awesome, it's fun to think about, and that song's pretty fun.
Amazing. Well, that will show up on our Spotify playlist. So thanks for the addition and a great way of thinking about it. I know some of them take a little negative turn, but some of them also have a positive effect. So thanks for sharing your optimism. All right. Well, before we close out, is there anything else that you or Startup Health is working on that you want to plug and so that our listeners know about?
Yeah. I mentioned that very at the beginning of the call that we have about 250 companies now, which is really fun. One of the things we're doing is really trying to get the word out about more and more of them. And so we have a weekly newsletter that goes out to everybody, and you can sign up for it at startuphealth.com. But it's a great way to learn a little bit more about what our companies are doing and what our entrepreneurs are doing and what they're about. And whether you're a pretty deep healthcare person or just somebody casually interested in healthcare or technology, it's a great quick read that comes out every Wednesday that kind of gives the latest on what some of our companies and entrepreneurs are up to, as well as healthcare technology in general. So that's my plug, but it's a fun read too. It's not too nitty gritty.
Amazing. Well, thanks and for sharing that. And I hope that our folks will go and follow along with Startup Health, their newsletter, and on social media. You guys always have some amazing stuff that you're putting out. So thank you, for joining us tonight and sharing all those insights about how, on a personal level or a professional level, people can really understand where they're having those wins and celebrating them, and where they can continue to grow from the not so perfect things that are happening in their life. So thanks again. And I want everybody to know to join us next week. We have another great guest, Peter Liu from Collectively, who's going to help us talk about choosing integrity, which will be a really amazing conversation about really kind of what we were talking about here too, is how can you make those decisions to get you where you want to be in life, either as a company or as an individual. So thank you again, Mark. Super great conversation, and we wish you well. And I hope I run into you at one of those conferences when we're not having FOMO, we're being there in real life.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. It's a lot of fun. I wish it was twice as long. I think we could cover a lot, but thanks for the invite, and looking forward to watching next week's.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Take care.